Hey, this is Jacob Eben. Thanks for tuning in. And in this video, I want to talk about deriving principles from Torah commands. I think this is an important consideration for how you're reading the text and how you're understanding the text, because oftentimes people will wonder why certain things are not in the Torah. Certain things from maybe their personal beliefs or beliefs that they have had before. And they may wonder, well, there's this situation that's kind of similar. Should we not just assume that maybe it's implied by that? And there may be some situation, some hypothetical situation, whenever we're talking about judgment in the land, keeping in mind that the Torah is designed as a essentially legal document for the people of the land. And so when thinking about some situation, we might wonder, well, there is a command that's maybe kind of similar to this. Do we just apply it as is, even though it's not exactly the way that it's worded in the Torah? How do we handle things like that? Or what about situations in modern times that may not precisely match things from the past? And although I don't think that things are really that different now from how they were back then, I think that people are essentially the same. But there may be some situations where we wonder about how far do we go in our interpretation of things. And likewise, there is this idea that's often talked about, although I kind of think it's misleading, the idea that Torah supposedly means teaching, which I think that direction is a better way of translating that. But if a person were to assume that it meant teaching, there might be a question of, if so, does that not imply some kind of principle being derived from it, rather than just the specific situation at hand, the specific situation that the command describes? One example that comes to mind is how you're supposed to have a parapet on your roof terrace or the flat portion of a roof, that you're supposed to have a parapet or guard of some sort on that to prevent people from falling. And so the question might be, does this therefore imply we're supposed to have all these types of safety measures and such? And I think one question that we have to ponder, that I don't really intend to answer right here, but I think one question we would have to ponder in response to any of those thoughts is, are these things going to be considered law? These things that we are inferring from the text, that we are deriving from the text, in a Torah legal system, would we be intending to prosecute according to these derived ideas? I think that's something to take into consideration, because are we just going to say it's a good idea? Are we just going to say it's a wise idea? Or are we going to say that it is a matter of following the law or not? And for me, whenever I had thought about these questions in the past, I wasn't entirely sure how it should be approached, because I could see merit in saying that maybe we could take at least some examples of commands in the Torah and maybe think that it could be applied in a slightly broader sense. But I also recognized how many other people that I had seen on the internet, for example, were taking commands and then going way out in left field with them, going just to some extreme where it's like, I have no idea how that can really be established by the text at all. I have no idea how that would work. And I think that could easily lead one to think that maybe common sense needs to be some kind of line here, that I'm sure that all of you have seen some interpretation like that, some general principle that's being made up, which just does not fit at all. And so the tendency might be to think that if we just applied common sense, if people applied common sense in judgment, that in those cases we wouldn't have to worry about these, crazy ideas. Now, I don't know if this is going to fit with anyone else listening to this, but I know for me that one thing I realized a long time ago is that common sense is simply not a thing. And I don't actually mean it in the sense of, people don't have it or something like that, or it's not very common. I mean that it's not a thing. I think it's just a code word or code phrase to mean my personal beliefs. So someone who doesn't have common sense, that just means that the person saying it is saying that they don't agree with their beliefs. That idea doesn't agree with their personal beliefs. And so I think it's very tricky to say that we just need to base things on that. And so I've wondered, well, where is the textual line on this? And that's what I want to get into in this video. And how I want to start off in the video is by talking about an example which all of us can agree on, an example which many of us have probably already heard about and already considered and already have a similar opinion on, at least in some sense. And that is regarding the supposed command, the tradition of not eating meat and dairy together. And I want to invite us to think about this and look at this in a visual way. I want us to think about what is the process that one would have to go through to arrive at such a conclusion, to go from "you shall not boil a kid in the milk of its mother," Exodus 23:19 and the other references, going from that to the tradition or the traditional observance of not benefiting from meat and dairy together at all. So I have up on the screen an interlinear text. It's read from right to left in accordance with the Hebrew, and underneath it is a rough translation of the word into a corresponding English word or English phrase. And of course, it is important that we pay attention to the Hebrew wordings. And so any English translation should not be the focus of any real delving into of a verse. And so in looking at this part of this verse, one way we could understand it just in English terms might be something like, "You shall not boil," or "you shall not cook a kid in the milk of its mother." And so this kid, this gedi, it is talking about a young goat or a young sheep, and then we have milk of its mother. And so just looking at this plainly, what are we going to conclude? It's rather narrow in scope in terms of what is being forbidden. This is a rather specific situation. We're talking about a kid, a young goat, a young sheep, and we're talking about the milk of its mother. It doesn't say milk in general. It doesn't say milk of that type of animal or something like that. It says a kid in the milk of its mother. And so this is a rather specific restriction that most of us are probably not going to be violating unless we're observing presumably some type of foreign religious practice. And so what would be the process of arriving at this much broader view, this principle of not deriving any benefit from meat and dairy, or not eating meat with dairy? What would have to be done with this verse? The first thing I would see is that one would have to get rid of this word which refers to his mother. That would just have to be eliminated because that's not being considered. It would just be milk. And really, one would also have to eliminate this kid and would need to change it to one of the words used for meat. And so that would result in something like, "You shall not cook meat in milk." And that's not really the full scope of the tradition either. So a person would have to eliminate this "you are cooking." That would have to be changed into "you are eating," because as we know, the tradition is not just regarding cooking it. And so since this verse says cooking, that verb is not fitting for the interpretation that is being derived from it. And my understanding is that the way this is normally observed, it's not just the eating of meat in milk, and so this may be kind of a nitpick, but it's likely we would want to, or the person that would want to do this change, the person would need to change that preposition there, removing the ba at the beginning of the word for milk. And really, the "you are eating" may not be sufficient in scope either. Maybe it needs to be even more broad, that a person is supposedly not supposed to benefit whatsoever from it. And so if a person were so inclined, that would need to be changed. That would need to be a different verb yet. And so I want us to consider what has happened to this verse. What has happened to the Hebrew text? What has needed to be done to this verse to turn it into that? And what is even remaining? And once again, I don't bring this up in order to just mock the process, although I do believe it is definitely illegitimate. I believe it is changing what the law says, something which we're not supposed to add to or take away from the words. And so, that being the case, it's obviously something which I believe to be wrong. But the reason I bring it up is because I want us to pay attention to the process. And in the process of doing that, I want us to also consider and compare that with one possible example of a derived principle. And this is one that I have wondered about previously for myself because of some situations that I've been in, some situations that I've heard about regarding aggressive dogs. And we have this passage at the end of Exodus 21 that refers to a bull or possibly an ox, which is goring. It gores a person, and as a result, the person dies. And the passage describes various situations, if the owner knew, if the owner didn't know, etc. And so let's consider this, because the example of a dog is probably more relatable now just because of shifting away from agrarian society. And the question could very easily arise out of this command by saying, can we kind of generalize what it's saying and extract a principle that we're going to apply to the situation with the dog, even though it doesn't say dog in this manuscript. It doesn't say animal in general in this manuscript. And if we're just talking about it in terms of what makes sense, if we're just talking about it in terms of what we personally think is sound reasoning, then we're probably likely to say yes, that would make sense. But what if we were to consider it in terms of the process that we just looked at with the other verse? What would have to be done to this verse to get it to fit that circumstance? Well, the first thing that a person would have to do is eliminate this shore or this bull or ox and replace it either with the word for dog or a word for beast in general or animal in general, since this Hebrew text does not read that way. That would have to be changed. And also the person would have to change the word translated as goring into either a word for biting or smiting or something similar, because goring is not going to fit with regard to the situation with a dog. And so that verb is going to have to be changed. The previous verb, the verb in the Hebrew text, this Hebrew text we're looking at, would have to be removed and replaced. And so what is happening? These words have to be eliminated and changed. Words have to be taken away from the law, and words have to be added to the law in order to get it to say the thing that the person might be inclined to think it should say. And I know there may be some objections because this idea is probably not something we disagree with in terms of our personal beliefs. And of course, with this particular example, it might make sense to say that it's in line with what we would deem the overall meaning of it, or it's in line with the same basic idea, the intended idea of the text. And one thing I think we have to wonder about is whether the intended idea of the text is going to be different from what was commanded. Is it going to be different from how Elohim chose to word the command? And this harkens back to that original question of where is the line? Deuteronomy 4:2 is the line.